Invitamos entonces a la profesora Stewart. Thank you very much for being with us. And it's all yours. Un aplauso.
Wait a minute, something's... Okay, I may get this wrong. First of all, let me thank you for inviting me. It's a great privilege to be here and to be at the start of this extremely exciting project, which is working on all the issues, really, that I've been working on most of my life. So I congratulate you. And I would also, it's a very great privilege to be in Chile with a female president, a female mayor, and so on, particularly in the light of the talk we've just had. So I'm very excited by the prospects for Chile. Now I'm going to be talking about inequality. I'm sorry, I haven't got it right yet. And I may need a bit of technical help here. Oh, it's come. Let me start. I hope this doesn't happen every time. We're going to be in trouble. Start with two quotations from two great men. One is Rousseau, which basically says, at the end of the day, we're all equal. We've made the same social contract. We should be treated equally. And the second is de Tocqueville, who said that if we want to understand conflict, at the end of the day, it's because of inequality. And that's really how I've come to inequality, because I was particularly concerned with conflict, and conflict in poor countries. Could you just show me this thing? How does it work? This side, okay. Okay, so why inequality has become a big issue in the world. It's not just here, all over the world, and it's interesting to speculate why. One reason is that it's rising very rapidly in many developed countries, and in many other countries, it's really becoming a big phenomenon. For example, just to quote a very famous statement that Oxfam has made, the 85 people in the world, the richest people in the world have the same wealth as the bottom 3.5 billion. I mean, that's incredible. And I may say it's been quoted by the director of the IMF, so it's now really understood. And then we have this well-known book, I'm sure you've all come across, by Thomas Piketty, which talks about capital in the 21st century and predicts that inequality is going to get worse. Now, oh dear, it's not gone quite right. If you take the world as a whole, inequality is falling, but not very much. And that is basically because China is growing, so we have a lot of poor people moving upwards. So we can't say that inequality is rising everywhere, and in fact, in the last decade, the situation with respect to inequality was much better than in some previous decades, and particularly in Latin America, where the majority of countries, from a very high level of inequality, have been improving a bit. Nonetheless, Latin America remains the most unequal region in the world, and inequality remains, as I said, a very serious problem. So here what I want to talk about is, first of all, inequality and justice. What would be a just distribution? Secondly, what are the effects of inequality on other things that we mind about, other valued objectives? And thirdly, what does this say about policy? So to start with inequality and justice, people talk about an equitable distribution, a fair distribution, and that's what we're really worried about. How much inequality is fair? Second issue is, how are we going to define inequality? And there are two big questions. One is, inequality among whom? What are we talking about? Is it inequality among countries, among groups, among individuals? And then the second definitional issue is inequality of what? Is it inequality of income, of capital, of health, and so on? And they're both very important issues. First of all, inequality among whom? Normally, we discuss inequality among individuals. That is when we talk about Gini coefficients and so on, it's normally individuals or households. But I've been very concerned with group inequality, which relates very much to the previous speaker's talk. Because it turns out that group inequality is very relevant for conflict, much more so than individual inequality, and in my view, much more relevant to justice, and I will say more about that. So what are we talking about when we're talking about groups? Which groups? You can categorize people in many, many ways. Some are pretty irrelevant, you know, people on that side of the room, people on this side of the room. Some are relevant, clearly, such as gender, such as age, and such as race, such as region, ethnicity, religion. What is the relevant salient identity varies a lot across societies, so you can't come to any general conclusions. You have to look in your own society and decide what are the really relevant categorizations, and they change over time. But they can become very important. They become sources of conflict, sources of inequality, sources of injustice. So let me now turn to inequality of what? That is the question that Amartya Sen famously asked, and his answer was, shouldn't be just about income or consumption, which is what we normally talk about. Life has many dimensions, valuable things that have many dimensions, things we value. And we should be worried about inequality in all those dimensions, in sense terms, in all the valuable capabilities that we have, in the things that we can be and the things that we can do. Income is important, but it's instrumental. You want income for a reason, not just income, but you want to be well-nourished, you want to do things with income. So income is just an instrument, and we should look at the valued things. When we come to horizontal inequalities, which is inequalities between groups, which is what I've been working on primarily, there are four very important dimensions. One is political power, because it matters hugely to groups if one group dominates the politics. And when I talk about the top politics, I don't just mean the presidency or the cabinet. I'm thinking about local government, about the military, about the justice system, and so on. Then there's economic resources, of course important, employment, income, ownership of capital, and so on. Then we have social resources, education, health, and so on. And finally, cultural status, which is not often, it's certainly difficult to measure, but is not often acknowledged as very important for groups. Is your language recognized? Is your culture recognized? Are your holidays recognized? And so on. And there's a lot of cultural discrimination around the world today, and it's very often a source of conflict. So let me now turn to what is a fair distribution, and what is the best distribution. And the first issue is, what would we think of as a fair distribution? And the second issue is, how does the distribution affect other objectives we mind about, what I would call the instrumental elements in determining a fair distribution? So start with inequality and justice. And I want very briefly to look at what some philosophers have said and what economists have said. Turning to philosophers, I pick out just three approaches, but it covers a vast terrain, obviously. And if you start with Immanuel Kant, who basically said people are worthy of equal dignity, equal respect. What can we learn about that for a just distribution? Well, I think the human rights approach to development is based on that perspective. People are equal because they're people. They should have certain rights. May not mean complete equality, but it does mean that they should all have access to a certain decent standard of living and access to health and so on and so forth. Second, the social contract. Origins, well, many people have started it, but let's say Rousseau, and taken up very famously nowadays by Rawls, and basically concludes, if we take the Rawls version, that you should maximize the position of the poorest group. Now, this is interesting when we think about groups, because the way to maximize the position of the poorest group might involve some inequality, because you need to give people incentives and so on. You need your economic growth. Maybe you need some inequality. So fair enough, may lead to some vertical inequality. Would it be consistent with horizontal inequality? I would argue with very little, because groups are consisting of large numbers of people where talent and motivation are more or less equally dispersed across the groups. So within the groups, to encourage the bright people and so on, you may need some inequality, but across the groups, if you have inequality, you're likely to harm economic growth. You're likely to harm incentives because you're leaving out a huge number of potentially very active and participatory people. So it has quite strong implications, it seems to me, for equality across groups, if not across individuals. Finally, we come to the entitlements approach of Locke and Nozick, who basically say that a just distribution is one which was justly acquired. The process was just. The way you got your resources was just. And that's been interpreted as leading to a lot of inequality, because Nozick says it's perfectly just to leave your fortunes to your children. That's legal, that's just. And they can leave it to their children, and we can have more and more inequality, and it's all just. Well, one can disagree with that perspective, but he has got a very important principle, which is called the rectification principle, which basically says if the resources were acquired unjustly in the first place, then it's unjust that you should have them, it's unjust the future generations should have them, and you are perfectly justified to redistribute income away from them. Now that's highly relevant because an unjust acquisition, according to Nozick, involves people stealing from others, people enslaving others, people defrauding others. And when we think about group inequality across the world, it's nearly all, the source of it is nearly all a question of enslavement, treating people fraudulently, discriminating against people. It's colonial attitudes, it's your dominant groups who have unjustly, in an unjust process, taken things away from other groups. And therefore, even Nozick, who seems, on the face of it, to justify as much inequality as you want, does not justify, in my view, group inequality. Well, that's a picture of inequality in the world, which is just to display. Now let me come to economists. If you go back to the origins of income and economists using income, it was very highly egalitarian. The idea was that income equals utility, utility equals happiness. You want to maximize the happiness of the greatest number, you maximize your income. That's sort of fundamental economic precept. But there was also the assumption that the more you have of something, the less utility you get, the less good it does to you. So you had what economists know as the diminishing marginal utility. It was applied to particular goods. If you had more apples, eventually you don't want any more apples. But it could also be applied to income. And Pigou, who was a famous British economist in the 1930s, said there was diminishing marginal utility of income, which makes a lot of sense. So in order to maximize utility across individuals, you should have more or less equal distribution. So economics, surprisingly, started as being very egalitarian in its philosophy. But then we have Lionel Robbins, an economist, who said, well, you can't compare people. Some of us get lots of utility from our income, and other people, they just don't get very much utility. So they don't deserve more income. So fundamentally, the poor would not get more utility if you redistributed, because the rich get so much utility from their extra income. And here you see this quote. In our hearts, we do not regard different men's satisfaction from similar means as equally valuable. Now that quote, which is just a quote, it's got no evidence, nothing, was immensely powerful on the economics profession. It actually decided we're really up to date, that you could not compare incomes across individuals for their welfare. It ruled out what we call cardinal comparisons. You could only look ordinarily, that you could say one person has got better off and others got worse off, but you couldn't say which was better, which was worse. So economists concentrated entirely on the efficiency and how to maximize production so that you couldn't get more production out of your capital and so on, but just ignored income distribution. And at the bottom, just to show you how powerful it was, we have a quote from Robert Lucas, who's a Nobel Prize winner, very distinguished economist. Of the tendencies that are harmful to sound economics, the most seductive and poisonous is to focus on questions of distribution. So economists really ruling out distribution in terms of justice. But economists are pragmatic and they want to maximize income, so they look at it in terms of instrumental objectives. So let me now turn to instrumental objectives. Well, I think I don't need to go through the conclusions. If I can. Now, instrumental reasons for a particular distribution are essentially what effect does a distribution have on other valued objectives? And then, of course, we have to agree about what the other valued objectives are. Let's start with growth and efficiency, sticking with the economists. Some people say you need more inequality because of incentive effects and saving effects, but others say you need more equality because if you have more equality, your human capital is much better. And as we know, your human capital is very important to economic growth. So essentially, theory doesn't tell you what's going to happen. You need to look at practice, empirics. And the empirical investigations on the whole suggest that more equality is associated with better growth. So in fact, it's the egalitarian philosophy which is more likely to generate higher growth. And most recently, some economists from the IMF, which is an institution which is not known for preaching equality, have found that if you want sustained growth, more equality promotes sustained growth. And here it says, if you closed half the inequality gap between Latin America and emerging Asia, you'd more than double the duration of your expected growth period. So that's a very important finding. To explain this sort of finding, Stiglitz, another Nobel Prize winner, has shown that behind the financial crisis in 2007-8 was one major factor was the rising inequality in US particularly. And his reasoning is that real wages went down and down, and there was no way in which people could consume the things that the productive system was producing, just on the basis of their income. So they had to be lent money. So mortgages went up and up. People lent money for house purchases. Credit card purchases went up and up until eventually this debt became unsustainable. You can apply the same sort of theory across the world to developing countries and how they have to borrow more and more to be able to consume because their incomes are so low. And so that is one of the major reasons why, if you have rising inequality, it's liable to lead to an unsustainable situation. Here is a diagram from these IMF economists, and on the extreme left is the effective income distribution on growth spell, which you can see much outweighs all the other factors that they looked at, including political institutions, which many of us might have said, well, yeah, it's all politics, that's why growth doesn't last, but they included that. Now, other instrumental reasons. Horizontal inequalities, conflict, and violence. This is an issue I've been working on for many years and really established, I think, together with many others, that if you have higher horizontal inequalities, group inequalities, the risk of violent conflict rises. And we have done studies all over the world, and we've got a lot of econometric evidence, and it's really very strong, the finding. It's interesting that the vertical inequality doesn't seem to have much effect on political violence. It has more effect on domestic violence and homicides and things. But horizontal inequality has a very important effect. And that's a very strong reason for worrying about horizontal inequality from our instrumental reason. Then we have inequality in crime, which is all over the world. We find that crime goes up when you have more inequality. Inequality and social cohesion. The president was talking about the importance of social cohesion, and so were others this morning. Very important issue. Inequality is very undermining of social cohesion, directly and in the way it affects trust negatively. So inequality is very important in terms of rising social cohesion. Other instrumental reasons, quite a lot of evidence on inequality in health all over the world, but inequality not only, of course, makes poor people's health worse, so we know that there's a lot of inequality in health, but it also makes the aggregate health of the society worse, possibly because of the tensions involved and so on. Inequality in education. If you have more inequality, the average level of education tends to go down because the poorer people are unable to afford to go to school and so on. Inequality, and also because they have less prospects of good jobs, even if they do, if they go to school. Inequality and sustainability. Here I'm talking about environmental sustainability, and this is obviously, I think, probably the world's biggest issue today. How are we going to deal with climate change? And one of the factors leading to unsustainable situation is everybody's pursuit of economic growth, from the richest to the poorest, everybody's pursuit of income from the richest to the poorest. And one of the big motives for getting more economic growth is to catch up others. I'm sure Chile wants to catch up OECD, UK wants to catch up Germany, Germany wants to catch up US, and so on and so forth. China's trying to catch up everybody. But then within countries, our big motive is to catch up. We all want incomes just ahead of us. If you ask people, their well-being and so on, they always look over their shoulders to who are the other people in the department and so on who are getting a bit more than they are and so on. So inequality is a tremendous motive for growth, and growth in turn is one of the big threats. And particularly at the rich end, we need to stop and get a new philosophy of life satisfaction, which doesn't necessarily involve increasing material resources all the time. And here, tackling inequality is one of the major, major ways in which we might achieve that. So I conclude then that political democracies, I'm just quoting, but this is my conclusion, that do not democratize their economic systems are inherently unstable, and that we need to do something about it. And just a reminder of a few of the inequalities we're talking about, the pay of chief executives in the UK is 120 times the average earnings. It was only 47 times only a little over 10 years ago. So the rise in inequality is terrible. And I was just reading yesterday that in the US, the figure is about 270, not only 120. So it's just incredible. There's a paradox. Inequality is high and rising. We recognize that it's an issue, and yet round the world, countries are taking policies which are increasing inequality, not reducing it. They are privatizing assets. They are liberalizing their social services. They are reducing their corporation taxes. So policy is going in the wrong direction, and I now want to think about policy. So policy approaches. I want to talk about some categories. Pre-distribution and redistribution. Pre-distribution is a concept that has been introduced in the UK by the Labour Party. They haven't said much more about it other than the concept, but it's sort of a nice term. Pre-distribution is what you do to the distribution of income before people get it. So redistribution is they've got the income, you take it away in taxes, or you give them something in cash or something. That's redistribution. Pre-distribution, you affect their incomes before they get it, or when they get it, which is politically very attractive, because if you can do something about the pre-distribution, or what we used to call primary income distribution, it's much easier than taking things away once people already have it. So redistribution is what we all know about. And then there are also direct and indirect policies. Indirect policies are universal policies that affect everybody, but have the impact of improving distribution. Like if we have universal services, then the people who didn't have the services before obviously get it, it's equalizing. Direct policies are when you target a particular group in the population. You say, we're going to give this group these services. So you have some choices on the policies. So let me think about pre-distribution. There's a large range of pre-distributions around the world, which is another way of saying there's a large range of distribution of income before you take into account tax and expenditure around the world. And if every country were to move to the best, in my view, the most equal, we would find a huge improvement in income distribution. Oh, I did have the chart. I don't know, did a chart pass? Yeah, that's it, yeah, thanks. This is the Gini coefficient of all the OECD and all the upper middle income and upper income countries in the world and their distribution of income. And at the left you see Sweden, the most equal in the world, and at the right you see South Africa, the most unequal in the world. And the red one is Chile. So not too good, actually. But if everybody moved to Sweden, a huge improvement, a huge improvement. So it shows you can do a lot with pre-distribution. So let me talk about some pre-distribution policies. Minimum wage. So people earn more when they get income. And then in UK, we've got a concept of living wage, which is basically not a statutory policy, but more of a convention policy, that there's pressure on companies and pressure on local authorities and universities and so on to pay a living wage, which is defined as, the minimum wage is not really a living wage, so defined as higher. Then we can reform the governance of corporations. So the CEOs have less power. At the moment, they more or less determine their own salaries. And you can change governance so that they can't do that. You can change the bargaining position of particular groups by encouraging trade unions, for example, and so on, so as to change what happens, what the outcomes are. You can have a maximum wage. Now, everyone talks about a minimum wage, but what about a maximum wage? And that is beginning to be talked about, and I'll talk in a minute about Switzerland, which proposed to do that, but didn't succeed. But having a maximum wage seems to me to be just justified just as much as a minimum one. And then you can change norms, which is more likely to happen with respect to maximum income. And Tony Atkinson, who's a very distinguished analyst of income distribution, has argued that a lot of the change in the pay of the very high pay is due to social conventions changing. It used to be unacceptable to have 120 times the wage, and now it's acceptable. And that if we could change conventions and norms, we wouldn't necessarily have to change legislation. Let me say a little bit more about Switzerland, because they've been very active in this respect. I think it's because they had this huge bank which crashed through all sorts of irresponsible policies and still continued to pay bonuses. They were sacking all the workers, and people got indignant. So first there was the proposal that they should have a maximum wage, but it was pretty low, and I'm not surprised it was defeated. It was 1 to 12. I mean, compared with, the ones I was talking about, that's very low. But they did succeed in passing what was known as fat cat legislation, and all 26 cantons, by a huge majority, voted for it, and it's now part of the Swiss constitution, that shareholders have a veto over salaries, golden handshakes are forbidden, managers of companies who flout the rules could go to prison. That's a big change. And we also have got some new rules in the EU who have capped bonuses at 1 year's salary. Of course, in this area, it's much better to be able to do things in terms of a region than to do it just as a country, because if you just do it as a country, you may lose your people to the next door country. Now let me move on with more pre-distribution policies. You can have pre-distribution policies towards the economy. For example, full employment it tends to improve income distribution. You can not only do that through macro policies, but a series of employment programs, credit for investments that create rather than destroy jobs, and so on. Support medium and small-scale enterprises, enforce competition, have a competitive exchange rate. These all improve the pre-distribution. Then I come to asset ownership, there's a huge range of policies here. Public ownership of assets clearly improves pre-distribution. Cooperatives and workers' shares in profits. And cooperatives can be very effective, can be very efficient, and clearly improve the pre-distribution. Land reform, equalizing educational opportunities, and then, of course, we could have more radical solutions like a limit, a maximum wealth, as well as a maximum income. Well, now I come to redistribution policies, which are much more familiar, and I won't spend too much time on them. More taxes. If you have more taxes in general and more public expenditure, that improves distribution, because public expenditure just is better distributed than original income, and that's a very strong finding. If you have more direct taxes and less indirect, that improves distribution. You can also redesign your indirect taxes to be more better for distribution, particularly if you exempt food and maybe basic fuels. Higher rates are more progression of income taxes, and then there are a whole lot of wealth tax, inheritance tax, and so on, which have been pretty effective in the past and which have been dismantled in many countries over time. Then on the public expenditure front, more public expenditure, as I stated, more social expenditure as a proportion of the total, health and education, social protection and pensions, infrastructure in low-income areas. So we know the sort of policies. So then direct targeted policies. You can have pre-distribution through quotas and targets for groups that have been discriminated against or are particularly badly off. And they have a lot to be said for them. They can be very effective and they're very visible. So if groups are very resentful of the situation, you can see that something's happening. You can, the same with respect to employment, asset ownership. And you can target on the redistribution side, you can have targeted food subsidies, targeted cash transfers, targeted scholarships, and so on. So both direct and indirect policies can be applied both to pre-distribution and to redistribution. So in conclusion, much inequality is unjust, and much of it is dysfunctional. It's dysfunctional because it affects adversely many other things that we value. Particularly in conflict-ridden societies, it's very, very costly to have a lot of horizontal inequality because you have an outbreak of violence and then you really do undermine your economic growth if that's your prime objective. And you undermine many other things. Now, there's a large range of policies to reduce inequality, and it is possible to do so, as we saw, by the range of inequalities in the world, even in a globalizing world. You're not prevented from doing these things, and national action can make a huge difference. And many countries have taken effective measures. So if we think about horizontal inequalities, Malaysia has had some very comprehensive, very effective policies to correct the inequalities between the Malays and the Chinese communities. And it's really been both effective, it's been peace-promoting. When they had a big crisis in that region and in other parts of that region, the Chinese were targeted in a violent way. This did not happen in Malaysia, so it's been peace-promoting, and it's also been consistent with very, very high growth, really respectable growth in that part of the world. So, and that's on horizontal inequalities. On vertical inequalities, there are many countries that take action, but of course Scandinavia is spectacularly good on that. And so finally, as Piketty states, in every country, the history of inequality is political. Very important finding. You can't say, we can't do anything about it, it's the economy. It is political. You can do something about it. But then he adds, it's also chaotic. So I think I'll end there. Thank you.